Hi, Scott from AJ Aircraft back again with build video number 2 for the 60-inch laser. Let's get started.
Okay, it's time to install a rudder servo. As you can see, we pre-drilled the holes, inserted the inserts in the servo, the rubber grommets and the metal inserts. Want to make sure that you got it programmed into your radial so the servo arm is 90 degrees to the body of the servo. You're going to make sure you do this with a little bit of sub trim. Don't use too much sub trim, but you want to make sure that that's 90 degrees. The other thing you're going to do is after pre-drilling the holes is use a little bit of, as you can see here, thin CA on the bolts, and just put in all your servo bolts, all 4 of them, as you can see here. So once you have the servo bolts installed, we're going to move on. Here, we'll just finish up this last servo bolt. Make sure the servo is nice and secure. And that thin CA helps that you put on there helps keep the holes, keeps the holes, the wood from splitting, and makes it for a nice good bite. Here you can see the servo arm length. I'm at about 1.75 inches on where the cables are installed, and I'm using a 2.25 inch arm. So that should be a good size arm for you to use. Here's the pull cable setup, 2.5 inch to 3 inch arm, but keep in mind you only have the cable needs to be the same distance apart from the control horn in the back of the servo, and you can sort of see that on the diagram. So here we're just installing the links, the control links into the pull cable attachments, and the goal here is to get both of these the same, so the loop size and all that is going to be the same on the right pull cable as it is on the left cable, just for good symmetry and good adjustment. That way when you're making adjustments to your cable tension, there's no other variables in there. So here you can see we're making the I'm using the little crimpers that are included in the kit. I'm going to feed that wire through and then feed it back through like you see here, and that's going to allow me a nice, like an adjustable, you'll be able to adjust this back and forth, a nice little adjustable wire while you're getting your servo set up and you're getting all your endpoints and everything. And here you can see that there's a closer look at that. This is what your pull cable should look like, and that'll give you a slidable link prior to crimping it down. And again, that's what you can see here on the one link. I got heat shrink over it to cap it all off. But here what I'm doing is I'm just matching those 2 links. I want those 2 to be the same exact. And you can see here I'm just going to pull that cable and give myself a little bit of more length on and then I'm going to continue to match those up. So again, that's really important. Okay, and as you're finishing up that link, you can see, go ahead and crimp it with a pair of pliers. Try to crimp it without the serrated part of your pliers, just a nice smooth spot on your pliers to crimp that. And then you're gonna drip thin CA on that to make sure that that cable doesn't move at all. Now what I did is I set up just the one side, and then the other side will be adjustable. So this is where now the one side setup, that's done. You can start from either the rudder side or the servo side. It doesn't matter. It's a little bit easier to start from the servo side and then adjust it out at the rudder. But here you'll see that I'm just applying the heat shrink and capping that off for a nice look, and making sure that none of those cables slip on you, so you don't lose any type of rudder movement or anything during flight. Okay, here you'll see I pulled the cables through from the rudder side. Here's the servo arm. I got the links, one on top of the servo arm, one on the bottom. That keeps your cables from rubbing when you get them crossed. And as you can see here, I'll go ahead and cross the cables. I pulled them through straight. Now I'm crossing them, and then we'll go ahead and put it on our links. Put our cables through our links there. You got to slide the crushable link on first, or the crushable coupler on first. Loop your servo wires through. Do that that adjustable link I showed you earlier in the video. Get that set. Then you'll go ahead and you'll see here, you'll get these adjusted out. You'll get them pulled tight. Get your endpoint set on your servo, and go ahead and make sure your servo's traveling in the right direction. And like you see here, make sure that that's what your links will look like. One on top, one on bottom, nice and snug. You want a good tension on your cables as well. And that's pretty much it for your rudder pull cable install. Later in the video, we'll cover setup and travel adjustments. Okay, we're going to install the servo in the wing now, the aileron. As you can see, we're going to put the drive side of the servo towards the leading edge of the wing. But here we're going to use the supplied little string to pull the servo lead through the wing. You can see it's glued on both sides, so just real easy. Tuck it in the wire, pull the wire through. Works real good. This servo leads are long enough to fit through the wing, so you may want to use a small extension to get to your receiver like I'm going to do. But here we're going to go ahead and pre-drill the holes as always. We'll pre-drill the holes. The grommets and the little metal washers are already installed in the servo, which you would always do with all servos when you install them. But I'm just going to go ahead and pre-drill the holes. Add a little, as you can see here, add a little thin CA to the holes. This helps any splitting or cracking of the wood. So that's important to do as well. Just a little added security there. So we're gonna go ahead and slip the servo in, and then I like to use the servo screws. We'll go ahead and screw all 4 of those down. Make sure that's pretty self-explanatory, but once we get these all screwed down, then we're going to move to setting the aileron hinge line. You'll see that the hinges are pre-glued on one side, as you can see here, which is really nice. It only allows you to pre-glue them on the other side. So we'll slip all these back in here. Make sure that we get them all in. One of the things you want to do when setting the aileron hinge is, you'll see from here that the hinge has got a little bit of room to slide. You'll see I can change that gap. So you want to make sure on the edge of the wing that your aileron is level with the edge of the wing, and then here that this gap is both even and then with the end of the wing, like you've seen there. So here you'll see you want to make sure you get that 45 degrees when you're flexing the aileron prior to gluing them, because that's what you're going to need in throw on your aileron. So you know, the hinge gap ends up being really super sort of tight. It ends up being sort of tight, so don't worry about that. You just want to make sure that you get a good 45 degrees of deflection and prior to gluing. And again, here I'm just going to mark, once you get that hinge line really flat, I just put a little dot on where the hinges are, because sometimes they're hard to see when you got the hinge line tight. That just gives you an easy place to wick your CA in from. Usually I try to mark the center of each hinge. Again, double checking prior to gluing. sort of that measure twice, glue once type thing. I'm just going to use a dropper and some thin CA here, and you'll see we'll just go right through and make sure our gaps are set, and we'll go right through and CA all the hinges. Wick a little CA in, it'll wick right down in there, wick it from the front, and then I like to do it on the top. It dries fairly instantly. Obviously give it a couple seconds. I like to flex the aileron, as you can see, to make sure I got the right flex that I need. Plus you want to also sort of make sure that there's no binding or anything going on where you glued the hinge. So you can see it happens pretty immediately, but yep, we're good to go. Now we're going to go ahead and glue in the control horn, and the control horn slot's pre-cut, as you can see. And here we're going to just scratch up the surface of that G10 fiberglass control horn. Make sure we get a good epoxy bond on that. So you can also see there's a little lip on the edge there. That little shoulder is for setting the depth of that, and you shouldn't have to do anything but push that down nice and flush, and then move to using 30-minute epoxy. I definitely suggest 30-minute epoxy or a Gorilla Glue or something like that for a good strong bond. 5-minute epoxy tends to be a little brittle, but here you can see just getting epoxy into the hole with a nice thin carbon fiber strip that fits down in there, and then we'll sort of get the epoxy down in there, make sure it's nice and coated. Use alcohol and whatnot to just wipe off the excess and set that aside. Okay, now we're going to install the servo arms. First, we're going to make sure they're 90 degrees to the body when they're set up, and we'll make sure they're traveling in the correct direction, as you can see here. I am using an 1.5 inch servo arm here, but right now I'm just setting the servo direction. So you want to make sure that before you do all your sub trims and all that other stuff to get that servo right, that the servo direction is traveling in the right direction. Just do that in your radio. So makes it a little bit easier when you have to make a change, or if you got the servo moving in the wrong direction. So you have to make sure you know that you're working on the left wing or the right wing, and make sure that direction's going right. Here you can see the ball link. The ball link has a specific side to it. The bigger side goes down on the servo, the side that's the furthest away from the link. I don't know, it's sort of hard to explain. And then here you want to use a washer on top of the link. That'll make sure that that little link doesn't slip off of that ball and you lose your ailerons in flight. So here we're just going to screw them into the servo arm, and then we're going to set the length of this link for your aileron. I like to just tape the aileron just real quick in the neutral position, and then make the adjustment with the turnbuckle here, as you can see. So we'll just make a quick adjustment to the turnbuckle, and we'll make sure that that fits perfectly into the control horn from the servo. Now keep in mind the radio is on, and we're making sure that this is set properly at the 0 90 degree position. So okay, we'll go ahead and remove that tape, and then just fine tune the adjustment on the aileron. Make sure that's even with the edge of the wing. We'll go back later in the video and set the throws up, make sure everything's perfect. But for now, you just want to make sure you get it extremely close. Again, your radio's on while you're doing this adjustment. We'll go ahead and put the nut on. I do like to use a washer here. It's not necessarily recommended, but you can. And then we'll tighten down that, and then we'll put on the servo arm bolt to hold the servo arm on, and that's it. Then you just repeat that on your second wing, and then we'll go set up the throws later in the video. But for now, we'll move to the motor install. Okay, here we're installing the motor and speed control, so we're going to prepare that for installation. You first do that by, just your soldering your bullets on the end of the motor leads, and then your battery leads for your speed control. Here you can see the motor leads are soldered on. We used heat shrink and it looks nice. You definitely want to make sure that you pre-fit everything before you just solder on your links, because you want to make sure you got your motor wires the right length and your battery wires the right length. But as you can see here, I'm sort of pre-fitting. I'm using the supplied Talon 90 clip but I've glued it onto a piece of plywood that I made that I'll fasten onto the plane. That way it sits nice in its supplied clip, and it makes for a real clean install, as you'll see here as I'm getting this fitted. So this works out really well. I'll just put this, I sort of use this little plywood plate here for a little bit more support as I'm installing this, but this is where it's going to end up gluing on right there, and then the motor leads will run right into that from its mounted position, so just like that, as you can see. Okay, we'll go ahead and glue that plate down, and we'll have the speed control sort of fitted and where it needs to be. We picked this spot for the speed control. You can put it on the side of the motor box, the bottom of the motor box, it's your own preference, but I like it down here. Next we'll move to mounting the motor. As you can see, I have the leads. I have a Hacker carbon fiber mount on the Motrifly motor. The firewall's pre-drilled for the Hacker mount. Here you can see I'm just using aluminum spacers. Now these spacers, again, you're going to want to pre-fit this and then put your cowl on to get an idea of how long your spacers need to be to set your spinner gap. So I've already done that, but I'll show you installing the cowl in a little bit. But here you can see we're just going to bolt on the Hacker mount to the firewall. Okay, like you want to make sure you're using blue Loctite, and make sure that you get that on all 4 bolts, because they're just using blind nuts on the inside of the motor box, so you want to make sure your motor bolts don't back out of there. So we'll get this bolted up, and you want to make sure, obviously, you get these bolts nice and snug, and then we'll move to go ahead and we'll move to plugging up the speed control. Once we get these bolts tight, the speed control's got, since I've pre-fitted it and made sure that it all works, it's a nice little routing right to the speed control with a Talon 90 is really convenient speed control to use. The other reason I'm using the Talon 90 is with the MKS servos, it's got an 8-volt BEC in it. So, but that's all, again, personal preference on your personal setup. I'm using high voltage servos, so I'm able to use the 8-volt BEC. But here you can see, once we get these all nice and tight, you'll see we'll go ahead right here and we'll plug up the speed control wires. Now here, as you plug these up, the next thing you're going to want to do is validate your programming, make sure your speed controls, your motor is turning in the right direction. And you can do one of 2 things. If you're using a Castle speed control, you can reverse it in the programming, or you can reverse 2 of these wires to change the direction of the motor. So as you can see, nice mounting and routing on the wires, and we're ready to move on. Okay, when mounting the cowl, you see I put some pieces of tape right over the cowl mounting pads that you'll see in the fuselage. I'll show you a picture of those in a second. But I'm going to go ahead and make a black mark with a Sharpie right where you're going to want your screw holes to be. And you want those, again, to line up with that pad that I'm talking about. And I'll show you a picture of those in a video here just in 1 second, as soon as I'm done marking these holes. And then once you mark the holes, you're going to want to go back and pre-drill your holes. But here's the pads that I'm talking about. You'll see right there behind the former, you'll see the pad where I've screwed the cowl on. So that's what you're looking for to get your black dot on. There's also a small part of that pad in front of that former, so depending on where your motor mounts are when you're fitting your cowl will decide on how you place those. So here we're going to go ahead and put on the canopy when fitting the cowl, otherwise the cowl doesn't fit snug on. And what we're going to do now is we're just going to fit the cowl to match the motor. So we want to make sure that we peel this tape back, and when we peel the tape back, we're going to then align the cowl to get the right spinner gap, and to also get it perfectly centered with the motor shaft. So, and you can see here is the spinner back plate, so we're going to go ahead and put the spinner back plate on, because that'll help you to align the cowl to sort of get the rough alignment down from both a spinner gap perspective. So now what I'm doing is I'm putting the tape on. This will actually hold the cowl in place, and then I can so here I'm just going to make a bunch of fine-tune adjustments, make sure that spinner gap is perfect, about a 1/16 to 3/16 of a gap, and then just take your time, make sure that this is center. You see I'll pull the tape up and redo it, and then put it back on. It's sort of a process to make sure you get that just perfect, make your plane look really nice. And once you're done, we're going to tape that, and then we'll go ahead and tape the top, and then we'll pre-drill the holes. And now you're just drilling, right in that black dot you made, and that black dot goes right through that mounting pad as you've seen in that earlier clip. So we'll just go ahead and pre-drill all these holes prior to mounting. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and hard mount the cowl once it's done pre-drilled. I use just a regular hex head that looks a little bit nicer than a Phillips screw that's supplied in the kit, but the Phillips screw is just fine. And then we'll go ahead and hard mount the cowl and be done with the cowl. And then we'll go to cutting the air hole in the bottom of the fuselage, and this is to let air escape the fuselage. So just using a sharp hobby knife, just cut this out, and you can clearly see it in the bottom of the fuselage, and you'll be all done with that. Okay, here's some examples of wire routing. You see the receivers mounted under the wing tube there. It fits nice right there. You can see I've used some zip ties to secure some wiring and clean up some wiring where I've mounted the satellite receiver. Also the two extensions for the ailerons, one with red, and which indicates the right wing. That way you don't ever plug your aileron extensions in backwards. But other than that, multiple ways to do wiring. So this is just an example. Okay, we're going to set up our control throws. As you can see, we've already set up the centers and aligned the ailerons so they're in the neutral position, and now we're going to go ahead and set up the high rates. And as you can see here, we're going to set up down 45 degrees, and then we'll set up 45 degrees, and we'll adjust the endpoints accordingly to reach that goal, unless you need a mechanical adjustment to achieve that goal. But remember, a mechanical adjustment will change your centers, so you may have to adjust accordingly. But here you see I'm going and setting the max throws to 45 degrees on both ailerons. Now I'm not dialing in any differential or anything at this point, but I am just setting the 45 degrees. That'll be something you do when you fly, but just going in and adjusting the endpoints to make sure both 45 degrees are obtained is the goal. And then, of course, when you do your mid rates and your low rates, you will want to go into your dual point settings and just dial down your percentages and add your expos and those other programming features that you're going to need to adjust your radio accordingly to the plane for the plane. So here you see we're just adjusting that, fine tuning that 45 degrees using my endpoints, and you can see there, right there, where I'm just dialing out a little bit out of the bottom, and then making sure the top continues to be 45 degrees. And then we'll go ahead and switch over to the other aileron and make sure again that our neutral is set, meaning the aileron is even, the aileron surface is even with the wing. And then again we'll set the 45 degrees. Now there's different ways of doing this. You can measure, you can use just measure to make sure that your up and down are equal, or you can use a degree gauge. For the ease of the video, using the degree gauge was the easiest. So there we go. We'll go ahead and make sure that those work. We got the 45 degrees set, and we'll move to the elevator. Same thing with the elevator. Since the elevator halves are joined, we're just going to go ahead and use the degree meter and set the 45 degrees. So right there was 46 degrees, and we'll go to the down and again set that as well. Looks like we're perfect. Make sure the counterbalance is even with the stab, so you're right at 0, and we'll set that 45 degrees. And then again, you're going to go back in your dual rates for your elevator and dial down mid and low rates. Your low rates being 10 to 15 degrees or whatever your personal preference is. Once we get that set and we're settled with that, another thing I like to do though real quick is make sure you warm up the servos nice and good prior to just setting and fine tuning. But so there we go, we got that set, and then we'll move to the rudder. Rudder is a little different. I like to get max throw and high rates on the rudder, and you'll see here I just make it until it hits the side of the elevator there, with the elevator in neutral position. And then I'll go ahead and measure it. It's a little bit harder to use a degree gauge on your rudder, so I'll go ahead and measure from the center of the rudder to the center of the horizontal stab, and then I'll just go back and make sure that I got equal throw on each side. But as you can see, the rudder is actually touching the elevator, and then we're all done setting the throws. And of course you go back in and do all your dual rate and expo settings. Okay guys, that's the conclusion of our 60-inch build video, brought to you by AJ Aircraft. Good luck flying, and continue to up your game.